But 50 yards away, hiding in the mud, the real king watches his body double die. He wears a common soldier's tunic. He is trembling. Desh, the loyal knight who wore the king's armour as a decoy, takes the final blow meant for his monarch. This brutal execution kicks off the Battle of Posada 1330. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Panic defined those 4 days in the mountains. To understand how a superpower collapsed into a panicked rabble, we must strip away the myth and look at the men holding the swords. Charles Robert of the House of Anjou did not ask for power. He took it. He spent his early reign crushing the Hungarian oligarchs who dared to defy him. He seized the gold mines. He centralized the currency. By 1330, he commanded the most feared heavy cavalry in Central Europe. His knights rode destriers bred for impact. They wore mail and plate that deflected arrows like rain. Charles looked at the map of Europe and saw a kingdom that bent to his will. He believed in the absolute authority of his crown. Basarab I, the founder of Wallachia, offered a different challenge. He did not meet steel with steel. He met it with silence and geography. While Charles built armies, Basarab built a trap. He unified the local voivodeships not through grand parades, but through necessary alliances against the Golden Horde. He understood that his light infantry could never survive a charge on the open plains, so he refused to give them one. The conflict started with a demand. Charles claimed Wallachia as a vassal state. He wanted taxes. He wanted submission. He wanted the borders secured on his terms. Basarab sent envoys. He offered gold to buy peace. He offered hostages. He tried to pay the ransom for his own country's independence. Charles spat on the offer. He viewed negotiation as weakness. To him, Basarab was not a ruler. He was a shepherd playing dress-up. The king gathered an army of 30,000 men. He brought the full weight of the Hungarian war machine to the border. He intended to march through the Carpathians, burn the capital at Carpathians, and install a puppet governor. The Chronicon Pictum illustrates this march. It shows the knights in perfect formation, banners high, confident in their invincibility. They expected a battle. They expected a field where they could couch their lances and thunder across the ground. Basarab gave them scorched earth. As the Hungarians pushed deeper into Wallachia, they found empty villages. Wells were poisoned or dry. Granaries stood empty. The enemy refused to show their faces. Hunger struck the royal army before a single arrow flew. The horses grew weak. The knights sweated in their heavy armour, marching through difficult terrain, chasing a ghost. Charles realized his mistake too late. With supplies running low and his army starving, he ordered a retreat. He turned his columns toward Transylvania, seeking the safety of the garrison. But the only way back lay through a narrow defile, a jagged scar in the mountains where the cliffs rose like walls on either side. Basarab watched the retreat from the ridges. He had waited for this exact moment. He let the vanguard pass. He let the king enter the chute. When the bulk of the Hungarian force squeezed into the narrowest part of the pass, where horsemen could not turn and lances could not lower, Basarab signalled his men. The trap did not just spring, it exploded. To grasp the sheer insanity of what happened in that mountain pass, we must first weigh the combatants. This was not a skirmish between equals. It was a collision between an empire entering its golden age and a state that barely existed on paper. Charles I of Hungary stands as the titan in this equation. History often calls him Charles Robert, a name that carries the weight of the prestigious House of Anjou. When he arrived in Hungary as a child, the kingdom was a fractured mess. Powerful oligarchs, the so-called little kings, ruled their provinces like private fiefdoms, ignoring the crown and terrorizing the peasantry. Charles did not inherit a throne. He conquered it inch by inch. He spent decades smashing these local warlords. He besieged their castles, stripped their titles, and centralized absolute power in his own hands. By the 1320s, Charles sat at the helm of a European superpower. The gold mines of Kremnica and the silver mines of Chemnitz flowed directly into his treasury. Hungary supplied a massive percentage of Europe's gold, funding a renaissance of art, architecture, and crucially, warfare. Charles possessed the funds to maintain a standing army of mercenaries and heavily armoured knights. He looked at his borders and saw opportunities for expansion. To the south lay the Balkans, to the east the vast steppes. He believed he had a divine mandate to bring order to these wild frontiers. In his eyes, he was the hammer of civilization. Then there was Basarab I. If Charles was the hammer, Basarab was the anvil, quiet, immovable, and forged in the shadows. The historical record surrounding Basarab is frustratingly sparse, often pieced together from the complaints of his enemies. He emerges from the mist of the early 14th century as the voivode of Wallachia. Even his name hints at a complex heritage. Basarab likely has Cuman or Turkic origins, suggesting a lineage tied to the fierce steppe nomads who had long roamed the region. Basarab faced a geopolitical nightmare. To his east, the Golden Horde, the terrifying remnants of the Mongol Empire, still demanded tribute and exerted influence. To his north and west loomed the hunger of Catholic Hungary. Basarab played a dangerous game of balance. He acknowledged Hungarian suzerainty when necessary to keep the peace, but he quietly consolidated his own power. He united the disparate Romanian Nyaz small polities, ruled by local chieftains between the Carpathians and the Danube. He built a coalition not on gold, but on survival. For Charles, Basarab was just another little king, no different from the rebellious oligarchs he had already crushed. He viewed Wallachia not as a neighbour, but as a buffer zone, a stretch of land that belonged to the Hungarian Crown by right. The king referred to Wallachia as Terra Transalpina, the land beyond the mountains, implying it was merely a wild extension of his domain. The friction began when Basarab started acting like a sovereign ruler. He expanded his territory, crossing the Danube to seize the fortress of Severin, a strategic gateway that controlled trade and military access. He stopped paying the tribute Charles demanded. In the courts of Visegrad, this was more than insolence. It was a breach of the feudal contract. Charles took this personally. He had spent his life bringing rebellious lords to heel. He saw Basarab's independence as a direct stain on his legacy. The king's advisers, eager for land and glory, whispered in his ear. They told him the Wallachians were primitive, armed with little more than farming tools. They claimed the campaign would be a simple police action. Basarab likely knew he was provoking a giant. He understood that defying Charles meant war, but Basarab also knew something the Hungarians ignored: the land. He knew that heavy cavalry, the pride of the Anjou war machine, required open plains to function. He knew that in the deep forests and narrow passes of the Carpathians, a knight is just a man in a metal cage. While Charles prepared for a coronation parade through the mountains, Basarab prepared the mountains themselves for war. The war began with a deceptive victory. As the Hungarian host approached the border in the autumn of 1330, they struck their first target, the Banati of Severin. This fortress, the bone of contention between the two rulers, fell with barely a whisper. Basarab withdrew his forces. He surrendered the stronghold without a fight. To Charles, this confirmed everything he believed. The Wallachian shepherd was retreating. The campaign appeared to be over before it had truly started. Confident in his dominance, Charles established a temporary court in the captured territory. Here, a final envoy from Basarab arrived. The message the voivode sent was not a declaration of war, but a desperate plea for peace. The terms Basarab offered were staggering. He promised to renounce all claims to Severin. He offered to pay all back taxes owed to the Hungarian Crown. He pledged to send one of his own sons to the royal court as a hostage, a living guarantee of his loyalty. Most shockingly, Basarab offered a direct indemnity of 7,000 marks of silver. To put that number in perspective, 7,000 marks represented roughly 1.7 tons of silver. In the 14th century, this sum could fund an army for months. It was a king's ransom paid by a man who wasn't supposed to be a king. Basarab was essentially offering to empty his treasury to save his people from an invasion. He was buying his survival with a mountain of bullion. Charles's advisers and seasoned commanders looked at the offer and saw reason. They saw a victory without bloodshed. They had regained the territory, they would receive a massive financial injection, and they had secured a hostage. Several barons urged the king to accept the deal and return home in triumph. Charles ignored them all. The Chronicon Pictum records his response with chilling precision. The king did not just reject the offer, he mocked the man who made it. He reportedly told the envoys, "Basarab is the shepherd of my sheep, and I will drag him by his beard from his lair." This sentence sealed the fate of thousands. Charles did not want the silver, he did not want the land, he wanted the man. The reference to Basarab as a shepherd was a calculated ethnic slur, dismissing the voivode's royal aspirations and reducing him to a dirty peasant hiding in a cave. The threat to drag him by the beard was an assertion of physical dominance, the kind a master uses on a rebellious serf. Driven by this personal vendetta, Charles ordered the army to press forward. He aimed for Curta de Argeș, Basarab's capital deep in the mountains. The king believed he was hunting a fleeing animal. He commanded his knights to mount up, leaving the safety of the captured fortress behind. They marched south, away from their supply lines, away from the open plains, and straight into the dense, ancient forests of the southern Carpathians. The easy victory at Severin had acted as the bait. Now, having refused the silver and insulted his enemy, Charles walked willingly toward the hook. The time for diplomacy had ended. The time for the shepherd to shear the sheep was about to begin. Charles led his army into a green hell. As the Hungarian columns pushed deeper into the Carpathian foothills, the roads dissolved into mud tracks. The dense canopy blocked out the sun. But the true enemy was not the terrain, it was the silence. Basarab had stripped the land to the bone. Every village the Hungarians reached was a smoking ruin. Granaries were swept clean. Wells were filled with animal carcasses or poisoned with rot. The shepherd had moved his flock, leaving nothing behind but ash. This was the scorched earth strategy executed with ruthless efficiency. Days turned into weeks. The immense baggage train, designed to carry loot back to Buda, became a dead weight. The 30,000 men began to starve. The Chronicon Pictum does not shy away from the misery. It describes knights, men worth their weight in silver, reduced to digging for roots. Pride evaporated. The strict hierarchy of the feudal army began to break down when the rations ran out. Hunger transformed the army. Soldiers looked at their prized destriers, horses bred for the charge, trained for years and saw their only meal. They slaughtered the animals they relied on for battle just to survive another day. Some accounts suggest they boiled their leather saddles to gnaw on the softened hide. Disease followed the famine. Dysentery tore through the camp, weakening men already fainting from hunger. Throughout this slow-motion collapse, the Wallachians remained invisible. Basarab refused to give Charles the battle he craved. He let the forest do the killing. Arrow fire would occasionally erupt from the tree line, striking a straggler or a scout. But by the time the Hungarian heavy cavalry wheeled around to charge, the attackers had vanished into the mist. Paranoia set in. The great army was fighting a phantom. By the time they reached the vicinity of Curta de Argeș, the capital was likely abandoned or too fortified to take with a starving force. Charles faced a humiliating reality. His army was dissolving not from combat but from logistics. He had dragged his men into a wasteland, and now he had to get them out. With winter approaching and his supplies gone, the king made the only choice left. He ordered a retreat. But he did not return the way he came. Perhaps seeking a faster route, or perhaps the original path was now too treacherous with mud, Charles turned his forces toward Transylvania via a different route. He aimed for the pass. The king believed the danger was over. In his mind, the campaign was a failure, but not a disaster. He was simply marching home to regroup. He did not know that Basarab had anticipated this specific route. The Wallachians were not retreating. They were racing ahead, climbing the ridges, piling stones and felling trees. Charles was not leading his men to safety. He was leading them into the kill zone. The exact location where the Hungarian army marched to its doom remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Romanian history. The name Posada itself is not a specific town on a map. It comes from a Slavic root word meaning passage or defile. Historians have spent centuries debating the true site of the battle, Some point to the Lapushna Valley, others argue for the Mohadia region or the Bran Pass. But while the coordinates are debated, the geography is undeniable. Basarab chose a place where the mountains acted as a vice. As the retreating Hungarian column entered the defile, the world began to shrink. The path was barely wide enough for a few horses to ride abreast. On one side, a sheer drop into a ravine or a rushing river. On the other, steep forest-covered cliffs rising hundreds of feet into the grey sky. The heavy cavalry, the pride of Charles's army, became a liability. In the open field, a knight is a tank. In a narrow gorge, he is just traffic. The formation stretched out for miles, a thin, vulnerable snake of metal and flesh winding through the rocks. Communication became impossible. The vanguard could not see the rearguard. The king, riding somewhere in the middle, was blind to what lay ahead. The Wallachians had prepared the ground with sadistic precision. High above, hidden by the dense fir trees and the mist, thousands of peasants waited. They had spent days loosening massive boulders. They had piled trunks of fallen trees at the precipice. They had cut arrows, and they had built a wall. As the vanguard rounded a bend in the deepest part of the gorge, they stopped dead. A massive barricade of earth and timber blocked the path. The commanders shouted orders to clear it, but the structure was solid. Confusion rippled down the line. Men shouted to move forward. Others shouted to go back. The column ground to a halt. It was the classic bottleneck scenario found in medieval ambush tactics. The Hungarians were compressed. Horses, sensing the anxiety of their riders, began to panic, jostling against one another. The knights were trapped in their saddles, unable to dismount in the crush, unable to turn their horses, unable to lift their lances. The silence in the gorge must have been terrifying. 30,000 men frozen in a stone corridor waiting. They looked up at the steep walls of the ravine. They saw nothing but trees and fog. Then a signal echoed off the canyon walls. It might have been a horn, a shout, or simply the sound of the first boulder tipping over the edge. The trap, set with the patience of a spider, finally snapped shut. The geography of the Carpathians had done the work of capturing the king. Now the gravity would do the work of killing him. The sky fell. That is the only way to describe the opening moments of the ambush. The Wallachians did not begin with a war cry or a horn blast. They began with gravity. From the high ridges, unseen hands levered massive boulders over the edge. These stones, gathering speed as they careened down the steep slopes, smashed into the packed column of knights below with the force of a siege engine. The Chronicon Pictum captures this horror in vivid detail. It shows the Wallachian peasants standing safely on the cliffs, rolling rocks and tree trunks down upon the Hungarians. The effect was catastrophic. Horses were crushed instantly. Knights, encased in expensive plate and chainmail, were flattened in their saddles. The armour that made them invincible on the plains became a metal coffin. It could stop a sword, but it crumpled like tin foil under the weight of falling granite. Panic rippled through the gorge faster than the arrows. The horses, terrified by the thunderous noise of impact and the smell of blood, began to thrash wildly. They kicked and trampled their own riders. The narrow path turned into a meat grinder. Those who weren't crushed by rocks were trampled by their comrades. Then came the arrows. The Wallachian archers, positioned high above the chaos, rained death down into the pit. They didn't need to aim for specific targets. The Hungarians were packed so tightly that every arrow found mark a neck, a gap in the armour, or the flank of a horse. The air filled with the sickening thud of bodkin points piercing flesh and the screams of wounded animals. Down in the defile, the Hungarian commanders tried to rally their men. They shouted orders to form a shield wall, to charge up the slopes, to do something. But orders were useless in the cacophony. The steep canyon walls were unclimbable for men in heavy gear. Those desperate enough to try, clawing at the mud and roots, were easily picked off by the peasants above or simply lost their footing and tumbled back into the crush. The slaughter continued relentlessly. The sun set, plunging the gorge into darkness, but the killing didn't stop. The Wallachians knew the terrain. Qualified. A peasant with a rock on a cliff was now superior to a duke with a sword in a ditch. Basarab's plan was working with terrifying efficiency. He wasn't fighting a battle, he was overseeing an extermination. The Wallachians did not engage in hand-to-hand combat. They didn't need to. They simply kept the high ground and let the physics of the ambush do the work. For the Hungarians, there was no enemy to strike back at. There was only the vertical wall of the mountain and the rain of death from above. The King of Hungary, the most powerful man in Central Europe, sat amidst this carnage, watching his grand ambitions turn into a pile of broken bones and twisted metal. And the worst part, the trap had only just begun. By the third day, the concept of an army ceased to exist. The gorge had become a tomb. The survivors were no longer fighting for the glory of the Anjou dynasty. They were clawing over the bodies of their friends just to breathe. The stench of 3 days of death, confined within the narrow stone walls, was suffocating. Charles I, the man who dreamed of uniting the East under his banner, now faced a stark reality. He was going to die here. The arrows were getting closer. The chants from the cliffs grew louder. The Wallachians were no longer content with dropping rocks. They were preparing to descend. In this moment of absolute terror, the king made a decision that would haunt his legacy. He summoned one of his most loyal commanders, Desiderius Hedavari, often known in the chronicles as Desh. The king stripped off his royal surcoat, emblazoned with the ostrich of Anjou. He removed his gilded helmet. He ordered Desh to put them on. It was a cold calculation. Charles knew the Wallachians were hunting for the crown. By dressing Desh in the royal regalia, he created a decoy. Desh accepted the suicide mission. He rode out into the centre of the kill zone, shouting commands, drawing every eye and every arrow to his position. The ruse worked with devastating efficiency. The Wallachian peasants, seeing the golden figure, swarmed. They abandoned their positions on the cliffs and poured down into the ravine like water. They carried scythes, clubs, and knives. This wasn't a duel between knights. It was a mob execution. They pulled Desh from his horse. They did not ask for surrender. They hacked him to pieces, believing they were ending the war by killing the tyrant. While his friend was being butchered, Charles slipped away. Clad in dirty leather, blending in with the terrified squires and foot soldiers, the King of Hungary scrambled toward the exit of the pass. He was accompanied by only a handful of guards. The hammer of the world fled like a thief in the night. Behind him, the massacre reached its zenith. With the king seemingly dead, the remaining Hungarian morale shattered. The Wallachians closed in for the kill. They moved among the trapped horses, slashing hamstrings. They pulled knights from their saddles and finished them on the ground. The casualty list read like a who's who of the Hungarian state. It wasn't just soldiers who died. The High Chancellor became a casualty. The Voivode of Transylvania was killed. Numerous bishops and high clergy, who had accompanied the crusade to bless the righteous slaughter, found that their prayers offered no protection against Wallachian steel. The Chronicon Pictum describes the scene as a red harvest. The flower of nobility was cut down not by chivalrous peers, but by the very class of people they deemed beneath notice. By the fourth day, silence finally returned to the gorge. The screaming stopped. The only sound left was the rushing water of the river, now running black with blood. The ambush was absolute. Basarab had not just defeated the invading army, he had erased it. Charles escaped with his life, but he left his honour, his army, and the myth of his invincibility rotting in the mud of Posada. The return of Charles I to Visegrad was a ghostly procession. Of the 30,000 men who had marched out with banners waving and armour shining, only a ragged few stumbled back across the border. They brought no gold, no hostages, and no glory. They brought only the story of a massacre. The king himself was a broken man. He had survived only by the grace of a disguise and the sacrifice of a friend. The psychological blow was immense. Charles had spent his entire reign constructing an image of absolute control, a monarch chosen by God to tame the unruly East. In the mud of Posada, that image was shattered. The hammer of the world had struck the anvil of the Carpathians and cracked. For Hungary, the defeat was a localized catastrophe, but not a fatal one. The kingdom was wealthy and resilient. Charles would eventually rebuild his army. He would continue to rule for another decade, guiding Hungary to prosperity. But he never returned to Wallachia. The dream of incorporating the lands beyond the mountains into the Hungarian crown died in that pass. The border was drawn in blood, and it would remain fixed. For Basarab, the aftermath was transformative. He did not chase the fleeing Hungarians. He did not attempt to invade Transylvania. He understood the limits of his power. He had achieved his strategic objective, survival. By destroying the royal host, Basarab achieved de facto independence. He was no longer a vassal to be summoned or a shepherd to be mocked. He was the great voivode, a sovereign ruler who had defended his realm against a superpower. The victory at Posada legitimized his rule in the eyes of his people, and grudgingly in the eyes of Europe. This moment marks the true genesis of Wallachia as a state. Before Posada, it was a collection of loose chiefdoms living under the shadow of foreign empires. After Posada, it was a country. Basarab I is remembered today not just as a warrior, but as Basarab Intimiatorul Basarab the founder. His dynasty, the House of Basarab, would rule Wallachia for centuries, producing descendants who would continue the tradition of fierce resistance against impossible odds, including a certain Vlad the Impaler. The relationship between the two states eventually normalized. Politics is pragmatic. Years later, Basarab and Charles would even sign treaties again, forced by the rising threat of the Ottoman Empire. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. They spoke as equals, or at least as distinct entities. The feudal chain was broken. Posada proved that a small, determined nation, utilizing its geography and united under a cunning leader, could defy an empire. It was a lesson that the Hungarian Crown learned the hard way. They stopped looking at the Carpathians as a gateway to conquest, and started looking at them as a wall they dared not climb again. Why did Posada happen? How does a ragged force of shepherds dismantle the finest war machine of the 14th century? To answer this, we have to look past the romantic idea of brave underdogs and examine the cold, hard math of asymmetric warfare. Posada was not an anomaly. It was part of a brutal trend emerging in the 14th century Europe, often called the Infantry Revolution. Just 15 years earlier at the Battle of Posada, Swiss peasants used logs and halberds to ambush and slaughter Austrian knights in a narrow pass. Later at Agincourt, English longbowmen would use mud and range to destroy the French nobility. The lesson is consistent. Technology does not guarantee victory. Context does. Charles I brought a laser to a knife fight, but he found himself in a room made of mirrors. He relied on heavy cavalry shock tactics. This doctrine depends entirely on momentum. A knight on a charging horse is a kinetic projectile, capable of shattering infantry lines through sheer mass and terror. But kinetic energy requires distance to build up. By luring the Hungarians into a defile, Basarab robbed them of their engine. A stationary knight is heavy, slow, and blind. He is no longer a warrior, he's a turtle on its back. Then there is the economics of the kill. War is an investment. Charles poured the GDP of a kingdom into his army. A suit of Milanese plate armour cost a fortune. A warhorse required years of breeding and training. A knight needed a lifetime of practice. Basarab's investment was zero. The weapons used at Posada were rocks, gravity, and timber resources that were free and abundant. The soldiers were peasants whose training consisted of living on a mountain. In economic terms, Basarab achieved an infinite return on investment. He traded stones for silver. He used the terrain as a force multiplier, allowing a single man to kill 100 without ever drawing a sword. But the true architect of the defeat was not geography, it was psychology. We call this command arrogance. Charles violated the fundamental rule of Sun Tzu, know the terrain. He didn't just ignore the terrain, he despised it. He was so fixated on the political narrative that he was the king, and Basarab was a rebel, that he forgot he was leading a biological organism, an army that needed food, water, and space. He committed the sunk cost fallacy. Even when the food ran out, even when the horses were dying, he pushed forward because turning back felt like admitting defeat. When he finally did retreat, he chose the route of least resistance for his ego, not for his safety. He assumed the Wallachians would be too scared to attack a retreating lion. He failed to realize that a wounded lion is just meat to the wolves. Posada serves as a timeless case study in military incompetence. It proves that superior firepower is meaningless if you cannot bring it to bear. It demonstrates that in the rock-paper-scissors of war, a rock dropped from a high enough cliff will always beat the sharpest scissors. Today, if you travel through the southern Carpathians, the exact site of the massacre remains hidden by the forests. Nature has reclaimed the bones, the rusted iron, and the silver marks, but the legacy of those 4 days in 1330 is carved into the map of Europe. Basarab I did not just win a battle, he bought time. By shattering the myth of Hungarian invincibility, he secured a future for his people. Wallachia would go on to survive for centuries in one of the most dangerous neighbourhoods on earth, wedged between the expanding Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Hungary, and later the Russian Tsars. It survived because it remembered the lesson of Posada. Never fight the enemy's war, fight your own. The House of Basarab became the spine of Romanian history. His bloodline produced rulers who would continue to use asymmetric tactics to defy giants men like Mircea the Elder and Vlad the Impaler. They were all students of the founder. They understood that when you are small, survival is not about honour or chivalry. It is about doing whatever is necessary to make the cost of conquest too high for the invader to pay. For Charles I, Posada was a scar on a golden reign. He died a successful king, credited with bringing Hungary into the Renaissance. Yet the chronicles suggest he never fully recovered from the humiliation of fleeing in dirty clothes, while his friends died for him. It serves as a permanent warning to the powerful. Hubris is the most dangerous narcotic in history. When leaders begin to believe their own propaganda, when they dismiss their rivals as shepherds or barbarians, they are already walking into the trap. We look back at the Battle of Posada not just as a clash of swords, but as a testament to human endurance. It is the story of how a group of desperate people, armed with rocks and rage, stood up to the crushing weight of an empire and said, "No further." It reminds us that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by the survivors. If you survived this journey through the mountain pass with me, thank you for watching. These stories of forgotten battles help us understand the fragility of power. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Posada, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary. And here is a question for you. Was Charles I's mistake simply arrogance, or was he a victim of the inevitable shift from feudal warfare to something more modern? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Check out this next video on the screen to explore another moment when the underdog changed the course of history. I'll see you there.